"You're too ordinary for this $5.3 million ranch," my mother said, giving it all to my brother. 3 years later, he almost lost it to the bank. At a crisis meeting, the lawyer revealed I secretly saved everything. They offered me half the ranch, but welcome to Van's Rock Stories. Have you ever been judged by the people who were supposed to know you best? Imagine spending your whole life proving yourself only to hear your own family say you were never enough. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or treated like you didn't matter, I think this story will stay with you until the very end. Before we get into it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy emotional family stories with unexpected twists. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that if I kept working hard and stayed out of unnecessary drama, things would eventually work themselves out. I was wrong. The morning of my grandmother Vivian's estate meeting felt strangely familiar. The funeral had only been a few days earlier, and I still couldn't get used to the idea that she was really gone. She'd been the one person in our family who never made me feel like I had to compete for attention. The law office hadn't changed much over the years. Same brick building, same waiting room with old landscape paintings on the walls. Even the receptionist recognized me and gave me a quiet smile before asking me to have a seat. My parents were already there. Dad nodded when I walked in. Mom looked up for a second before returning to the papers in front of her. "Claire," she said. "Mom." That was the entire conversation. My younger brother Ethan arrived a couple of minutes later carrying 2 coffees. He handed one to Mom without asking what she wanted. Dad thanked him. Then Ethan looked at me. "You want this one?" he asked, lifting the extra cup. I smiled politely. "No, thanks." "Suit yourself." It wasn't rude, it also wasn't warm. That pretty much described our relationship. People always assumed Ethan and I hated each other. The truth was more complicated than that. We weren't enemies. We were just raised with very different expectations. Ethan had always been treated like the future of Bennett Ranch, the future owner, the future businessman, the future everything. I was dependable. If paperwork needed to be organized, people called me. If Grandma needed someone to drive her to appointments, I went. If fences needed checking after a storm, Ethan got praised for helping once. If I spent an entire weekend doing the same thing, nobody really mentioned it. After enough years, you stop asking why. You just learn where you stand. Still, I didn't walk into that meeting expecting a fight. Honestly, I wasn't even thinking about money. Grandma Vivian had loved that ranch more than anyone. I figured she'd leave clear instructions, maybe split things fairly, maybe leave certain responsibilities to different people. Whatever she'd decided, I wanted to respect it. That was how she'd raised me. As long as her wishes were honored, I could live with almost anything. Daniel Morris, our family's attorney for as long as I could remember, stepped into the conference room carrying a thick leather folder. He greeted everyone individually before sitting at the head of the table. "I appreciate all of you coming," he said. "I know this has been a difficult week." Nobody answered. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy. Daniel adjusted his glasses and looked around the table as if making sure everyone was ready. "I understand everyone is expecting today's meeting to begin with Vivian Bennett's will." I noticed Mom straighten in her chair. Dad folded his hands together. Even Ethan leaned forward. Daniel paused for just a moment. "However," he said carefully, "before we discuss Mrs. Bennett's will, there's another legal document that must be addressed first." The room grew noticeably quieter. He opened the leather folder and rested one hand on the first page. "This document is the Bennett Family Asset Trust." Daniel looked around the room one more time before he began reading. "This trust was established by Mrs. Vivian Bennett approximately 22 months ago." I blinked. 22 months? For a second, I thought I'd heard him wrong. Grandma had still been healthy back then. She was slowing down a little, sure, but she was still riding around the ranch, still checking fences herself, still calling me every Sunday evening just to ask if I was eating enough. She'd never mentioned a trust. Not once. Dad didn't seem surprised. Mom kept her eyes on Daniel. Ethan shifted in his chair but stayed quiet. Daniel continued reading through several pages of legal language. Most of it sounded like exactly what you'd expect from estate documents. Names, definitions, trustees, asset schedules. Then he reached the section that actually mattered. Upon activation of the Bennett Family Asset Trust. He paused just long enough for everyone to look up. Ownership and management rights of Bennett Ranch, including the horse breeding facilities, training arena, residential structures, equipment, and approximately 450 acres of surrounding land. My heartbeat picked up. Shall transfer in full to Ethan Bennett. Silence. Real silence. I instinctively looked at Ethan. His eyes widened for half a second before he quickly looked down at the table. I couldn't tell whether he already knew. Daniel kept reading as if nothing unusual had happened. The trustee has determined that the transfer shall be immediate and complete under the terms outlined within this agreement. No mention of me. Not yet, anyway. Maybe there were other assets. Maybe Grandma had separated things. I waited. Daniel carefully turned another page. There are several financial accounts and investment distributions outlined in later sections, he explained. But regarding the ranch itself, ownership is transferred entirely to Mr. Ethan Bennett. Mom slowly let out a breath I'd barely noticed she'd been holding. Dad gave Ethan a firm pat on the shoulder. Congratulations, son, he said quietly. Ethan gave an awkward smile. Thanks. He didn't sound excited. If anything, he sounded overwhelmed. I wasn't angry. Not immediately. Mostly I was confused. Grandma loved that ranch with everything she had. She also knew how much time I'd spent there over the years. She was the one who taught me how to identify healthy pasture grass. She showed me how different sections of land held water after heavy rain. She even joked once that I cared more about soil reports than normal people cared about sports. Why would she leave every acre to Ethan without saying anything to me? Daniel continued reviewing smaller financial details. There were investment accounts, insurance policies, equipment inventories, a few charitable donations. I listened carefully every time he turned another page. My name appeared once. Vivian had left me several personal belongings, family photographs, a collection of journals, one antique walnut document chest. That was all. No ownership, no management role, no voting rights, nothing connected to the ranch. Daniel finally closed the folder. Legally speaking, he said, those are the primary terms of the trust. Nobody spoke. The air felt strangely heavy. I glanced toward Ethan again. He still wasn't looking at me. Instead, he kept rubbing the paper coffee cup between his hands like he didn't know what to do with them. Part of me almost wanted to make things easier, to tell him I wasn't upset, to congratulate him. But before I could say anything, Mom slowly leaned forward in her chair. Daniel. She folded her hands together. If we're finished with the legal part? She turned toward him with the calmest expression I'd seen all morning. I'd like to say something before this meeting ends. Mom waited until Daniel gave her a small nod. She didn't sound angry. She didn't even sound emotional. That was probably what made her words hit so much harder. I know today's decision may seem unfair at first, she said, looking directly at me, but your grandmother and I talked many times about the future of this family. I frowned. Grandma never mentioned those conversations to me. Mom continued as if she were explaining something completely reasonable. Ethan has always been prepared to lead the ranch. He understands the business. He knows the horses. He knows what this family has built. I looked at Ethan. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His eyes stayed on the table. Then Mom turned fully toward me. And Claire, she smiled politely. You've always been too ordinary to carry something this big. Nobody reacted. Not Daniel. Not Dad. Not Ethan. For a second, I honestly wondered if I'd imagined hearing it. Too ordinary. Out of everything she could have said, that was what she chose. I slowly let out the breath I'd been holding. I see, I said. Mom nodded as though we'd reached an understanding. It's not an insult. I almost laughed. It's simply who you are, she added. You've always preferred simple work, a quiet life. You avoid risks. That's not the person who should be responsible for a ranch worth millions. I wanted to ask if driving Grandma to doctor's appointments had been ordinary, if spending weekends repairing fences while Ethan was away at college had been ordinary, if handling paperwork whenever Grandma got overwhelmed had counted as ordinary. But none of those questions would change anything sitting on that table. Dad finally cleared his throat. Your mother's just trying to explain the decision. I looked at him. So, you agree with her? He hesitated, long enough to answer without actually saying the word. I think this is what's best for the ranch. That was enough. I turned toward Ethan. He finally met my eyes. Claire. His voice was quiet. I didn't ask for Mom to say it like that. No, I replied. You didn't. He opened his mouth again, then closed it. He wasn't defending me. He wasn't refusing the ranch either. He just sat there, holding the paperwork that had handed him everything. Daniel broke the silence. For what it's worth, Claire, these decisions aren't easy for any family. I appreciated that he was trying, but there wasn't really anything he could say. I gave him a small smile. I know. The room felt smaller than when I'd walked in. Nobody looked happy. Not even Ethan. Mom believed she'd protected the future of the family. Dad looked relieved. The difficult conversation was almost over. Ethan looked like someone who'd accidentally won a prize he wasn't sure he deserved. And me? I realized something that surprised even myself. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Mostly, I was tired. Tired of trying to earn a place that apparently had already been assigned to someone else years ago. I reached for my bag beside the chair. The zipper sounded strangely loud in the quiet room. Mom watched me. Claire. I stood. I think we're finished here. You don't have anything you'd like to say? She asked. I thought about it for a moment. There were probably 100 things I could have said. None of them would matter. So I simply looked at Daniel. Thank you for handling everything professionally. He gave me a respectful nod. You're welcome. Then I looked at Ethan. Take care of the ranch. His expression tightened. I will. I hope so. I meant it. Whether anyone believed me or not. I pulled my chair in, picked up my coat, and walked toward the conference room door. No one tried to stop me. No one argued. No one said the decision should be reconsidered. The only sound behind me was the soft click of Daniel gathering the legal papers as I reached for the door handle and quietly walked out of the room. The hallway outside the conference room felt strangely quiet. I walked past the receptionist with my coat folded over one arm, hoping I could make it to my car before anyone came after me. I had almost reached the front door when I heard footsteps behind me. Claire. I turned. Daniel Morris was walking toward me, holding the leather folder against his side. Do you have a minute? I managed a small smile. Sure. He stopped a few feet away, like he didn't want to crowd me. I just wanted to make sure you're all right. I let out a quiet laugh. I don't think anyone's ever all right after a meeting like that. No, he admitted. Probably not. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Daniel had known my family for decades. He'd watched Ethan and me grow up. He'd handled business for my grandparents long before I was old enough to understand what a contract even was. If anyone in town knew how complicated the Bennett family could be, it was him. Finally, he cleared his throat. I imagine you'll want to discuss your legal options. My legal options? If you decide to challenge the trust. I stared at him for a second. Then I shook my head. No. He blinked. No. I'm not contesting it. He looked genuinely surprised. Claire, people challenge estate plans for far less than this. I know. You understand that if you believe there was undue influence or… I heard the document. I interrupted gently. It was created almost 2 years ago. It was witnessed properly. Everything sounded legal. Daniel studied my face, almost as if he were trying to figure out whether I was hiding my emotions. You don't even want me to review possible claims? What would be the point? He didn't answer immediately. I've seen families spend years in court, I continued. Thousands of dollars, holidays ruined, relationships destroyed. I smiled, though it didn't quite reach my eyes. I don't think Grandma would have wanted that. Daniel slowly nodded. I suppose she wouldn't. I lost my grandmother this week, I said quietly. I'm not interested in losing whatever dignity I have left fighting my parents. The words hung between us. He looked down for a second before speaking again. I owe you an apology. That caught me off guard. For what? I assumed you'd walk out of that room angry? I was. I assumed you'd come back with another attorney. I couldn't help smiling a little. You've known me since I was 10. I have. Then you should know revenge has never really been my thing. A small chuckle escaped him. Fair enough. Someone inside the office opened a door and voices drifted into the hallway. My parents were still talking with Ethan. I couldn't make out the words, and honestly, I didn't want to. I adjusted my bag on my shoulder. I should get going. Daniel nodded. I understand. I took 2 steps toward the entrance before he called my name again. Claire. I turned. I almost forgot. He frowned as though he'd just remembered something important. Vivian left something here. My eyebrows lifted. For me? Specifically for you. He disappeared back into his office. A minute later, he returned carrying a medium-sized walnut chest with brass corners. It wasn't large enough to be furniture, but it was too heavy to be just a decorative box. I recognized it immediately. It used to sit on a shelf in Grandma's study. I'd seen it my whole life. I'd never once seen her open it. Daniel carefully placed it on a nearby table. She instructed me to give this to you personally. I looked at the chest, then back at him. When? The day she signed the trust. He rested his hand lightly on the lid. And she was very clear about one thing. His expression softened. This wasn't to be opened here. He gently slid the walnut chest across the table toward me. The walnut chest barely fit in the back seat of my SUV. I glanced at it more than once during the drive home, but I never stopped to open it. If Grandma had wanted me to see whatever was inside immediately, she would have told Daniel to hand it to me before the meeting. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. Silver Pines was about an hour away from the ranch. Close enough to visit if I wanted to, but far enough that I rarely ran into anyone from my family. That distance turned out to be exactly what I needed. By Monday morning, I was back at work. No dramatic announcement, no long vacation, just another stack of permit applications waiting on my desk. I worked as an environmental compliance consultant. It wasn't the kind of job people usually dreamed about when they were kids, but I genuinely liked it. Most of my clients were farmers, ranch owners, or families trying to keep land that had been in their names for generations. Some needed conservation permits. Others were applying for state grants, or trying to meet environmental requirements before expanding their property. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. Morning, Claire. I looked up as my coworker Megan walked past my office carrying 2 folders. You survived the funeral? I smiled. Barely. She leaned against the doorframe. Family stuff? When isn't it? She laughed. Fair point. She didn't push for details, and I appreciated that. Around lunchtime, an older ranch owner named Mr. Alvarez stopped by with homemade cookies his wife had baked. I figured you skipped lunch again, he said. I did not. You absolutely did. He pointed at the untouched sandwich still sitting beside my keyboard. I was getting to it. Claire. He folded his arms. You've spent 2 months helping us straighten out paperwork the county kept rejecting. You can take 10 minutes to eat. I couldn't argue with that. He wasn't my only client who treated me that way. Over the next few weeks, people kept stopping by my office. Some needed advice. Some just wanted to say thank you. One family brought fresh peaches from their orchard. Another insisted on dropping off homemade jam because a grant I'd helped them secure allowed them to keep their land instead of selling part of it. You saved us, one woman told me quietly. I shook my head. No, I just explained the process. She smiled. You make it sound easy. It wasn't easy. There were regulations, inspections, deadlines, endless forms, and more government paperwork than most people ever wanted to see. But I understood it. I liked solving problems that made people feel stuck. That was enough for me. One afternoon, Megan rolled her chair over to my desk. You know, she said, you've kind of become the person everyone asks for. What do you mean? If someone can't figure something out, she pointed at me. They say, go ask Claire. I laughed. I don't know about that. I'm serious. She lowered her voice dramatically. I think half the county believes you can fix anything involving land. I smiled but didn't answer. If my mother had heard that conversation, she probably would have called it ordinary too. Funny how different people can look at the exact same person and see completely different things. Life slowly settled into a routine: work during the day, dinner at home, weekends catching up on laundry, grocery shopping, and the occasional hike whenever I could convince myself to leave the house. The Bennett Ranch barely came up anymore. Neither did Ethan. Neither did my parents. It wasn't that I'd forgiven everything. I just stopped letting it take up every spare thought. Every evening, though, as I walked through my living room, my eyes landed on the same thing: the walnut chest. I'd placed it in the corner near the bookshelf the day I brought it home. Untouched, still locked, still carrying whatever Grandma had decided was meant only for me. More than once I walked over and rested my hand on the lid. More than once I almost opened it. Every time, I quietly changed my mind and walked away, leaving the walnut chest exactly where it had been since the day I brought it home. I think we're out of options. Mr. Carter pushed a thick folder across my desk and rubbed both hands over his face. I've filed everything twice. The county keeps rejecting it. I opened the file and started flipping through the paperwork. Who helped you prepare the conservation application? My accountant. I nodded. That explains part of it. He gave me a confused look. My accountant's been doing our taxes for 20 years. I'm sure he's great with taxes, I said with a small smile. This isn't really a tax issue. I pulled out one of the maps. See this creek running along the east side? He leaned closer. Yeah. The county still has it listed under an old watershed classification from almost 15 years ago. His eyebrows lifted. I didn't even know that. Most people don't. I reached for another document. Because of that, they're evaluating your property under the wrong environmental category. So every application you've submitted has been reviewed using outdated requirements. He stared at me for a second. Seriously? I think we can fix it. His shoulders dropped as if someone had just taken 50 pounds off them. For the next hour, we went through maps, survey records, and state guidelines together. It wasn't exciting work. There weren't dramatic speeches or huge breakthroughs. Just careful questions, careful answers, one document leading to another until the whole picture finally made sense. Before he left, Mr. Carter stood beside my desk holding the corrected paperwork. I've spent 8 months trying to solve this. I smiled. You probably won't have to wait much longer. If this works, he paused. You'll save my family's ranch. I shook my head. No. You did the hard part by refusing to give up. He laughed. You're really bad at taking credit. Occupational hazard. A week later, he called my office before I had even finished my morning coffee. They approved it. I had to pull the phone away from my ear because he was practically shouting. They approved everything. Congratulations. My wife cried. I hope those were happy tears. They absolutely were. He went quiet for a second. I don't know how to thank you. You already did. How? You kept your land. When I hung up, Megan was standing outside my office with both eyebrows raised. Another miracle? Hardly. She stepped inside carrying a file she'd obviously come to discuss before overhearing the conversation. You know what's funny? What? People think you're some kind of magician. I laughed. I'm definitely not. You kind of are. She dropped into the chair across from me. I've watched consultants come and go for years, most of them no regulations. She pointed toward me. You know how all the regulations fit together. I shrugged. I've just been doing it a while. No, she shook her head. You see connections other people miss. I looked back at the paperwork on my desk. Maybe. Or maybe I'd simply spent enough years listening to landowners describe problems that I learned where to look first. Every property had a story. Most people only saw acreage. I saw drainage patterns, permit history, soil classifications, old easements, conservation opportunities. Tiny details that seemed unrelated until they suddenly weren't. That afternoon, another client stopped by without an appointment. He wasn't there because something had gone wrong. He only wanted to shake my hand before heading home. My daughter starts college this fall, he said. If we'd lost that property, he smiled. That wouldn't have happened. I wished him luck, and after he left, I sat quietly for a moment. It was strange. The people I worked for trusted my judgment with land worth millions of dollars. County officials called when they had complicated questions. Attorneys occasionally asked me to review environmental language before filing documents. Yet somewhere in the back of my mind, I could still hear my mother's voice. Too ordinary. Earth to Claire. I looked up. Megan was leaning against my office door again. You disappeared for a minute. Sorry. She smiled. I've been meaning to ask you something. Go ahead. She tilted her head curiously. If you're this good with ranches? She hesitated just long enough to make me look up from my desk. How come you've never worked with your own family's ranch? I looked at Megan for a second before answering. My family's ranch already has someone running it. She waited. That's it? I smiled. That's the short version. She crossed her arms with a grin. And the long version? I don't tell the long version at work. She laughed. Fair enough. There wasn't any awkward silence after that. Megan simply nodded, picked up the file she'd come to discuss in the first place, and slid it across my desk. Okay, business it is. I appreciated that more than she probably realized. Some people hear there's family drama and immediately start digging for details. Megan never did. If I wanted to talk, she'd listen. If I didn't, she let it go. By the end of the afternoon, neither of us mentioned my family again. That became a pattern. Whenever someone recognized my last name, I'd keep the conversation simple. Any relation to the Bennett Ranch? Yeah. You ever work out there? Not anymore. Oh. And that was usually the end of it. I preferred it that way. My work belonged to me. The Bennett family belonged to my past. Keeping those two worlds separate made life much easier. A few days later, I stopped at the local grocery store after work. As I reached for a carton of milk, I heard someone call my name. Claire? I turned and recognized Mrs. Holloway, one of Grandma Vivian's oldest friends. She pulled me into a warm hug before I could even say hello. I've been meaning to call you, she said. How are you holding up? I'm doing okay. You look tired. I've been busy. She gave me the kind of look only women her age seem able to give, the one that quietly says, I know that's not the whole truth. Instead of pressing me, she smiled. Vivian always worried you'd work too much. I laughed softly. She wasn't wrong. Mrs. Holloway reached into her shopping cart and handed me a small jar wrapped with a ribbon. Peach preserves. You didn't have to do that. I know. She squeezed my hand. But your grandmother would have wanted someone to make sure you were eating something besides frozen dinners. That made me smile for real. We talked for another few minutes about the weather, her garden, and how quickly the town seemed to change every year. Not once did she ask about the inheritance. Not once did she mention Ethan. When we said goodbye, I realized how grateful I was for that. Some people showed kindness by asking questions. Others showed it by knowing which questions not to ask. Back at home, I unpacked my groceries while music played quietly from my phone. The house wasn't big. Just enough space for me. For the first time in a long while, it actually felt peaceful. I made dinner, answered a couple of work emails, and reviewed my schedule for the next morning. By 10 o'clock, I was ready to call it a night. As I walked toward the hallway, my eyes landed on the walnut chest again. It hadn't moved. Dust hadn't even had time to settle on it. I walked over without really thinking about it. My fingers brushed across the smooth wood. Grandma had touched this. She'd chosen it. She'd told Daniel to make sure it reached me. I crouched down and carefully lifted the brass latch. It wasn't locked. I hesitated. For some reason, opening it suddenly felt much bigger than opening a box. It felt like saying goodbye to Grandma one final time. I rested both hands on the lid, took a slow breath, then quietly closed the latch again. Not tonight, I whispered. I stood, turned off the living room light, and headed toward my bedroom. The walnut chest remained exactly where it was, waiting in the darkness, unopened. One season turned into another before I really noticed how much my life had changed. The anniversary of Grandma Vivian's funeral came and went, then another. Somewhere along the way, nearly 3 years slipped by. My days became predictable in the best possible way. Coffee before sunrise, a full calendar before 8, site visits, permit reviews, county meetings, and enough paperwork to keep me busy long after most people had gone home. I wasn't just helping local ranchers anymore. People from neighboring counties started calling. Word travels fast in farming communities. One successful project usually leads to another. If Claire says there's a solution, one client joked during a county meeting, I stop worrying. Everyone laughed. I did too. Mostly because I still wasn't used to hearing people put that much confidence in me. One Friday afternoon, my supervisor, Linda, stopped outside my office. You've got a minute? Sure. She closed the door behind her and sat across from me. I've been looking over this year's numbers. I wasn't sure where the conversation was going. You've taken on almost 30% more cases than anyone else. I guess it's been busy. It has, she smiled. But your clients also have the highest approval rate in the department. I shrugged. I've had good teams to work with. Linda laughed. There you go again. What? Giving everyone else credit. I smiled. Old habit. She slid a folder across my desk. We're expanding next quarter. I looked at the paperwork. I'd like you to supervise 2 new consultants. I blinked. Me? You've already been doing it without the title. I wasn't expecting that. I'll think about it. I already know your answer. Oh? She stood. You'll say yes because you won't want the new people making avoidable mistakes. She wasn't wrong. As soon as she left, I laughed to myself. Maybe I had become predictable. Not in a bad way. Just settled. My apartment started feeling less like a temporary stop and more like home. I finally replaced the old secondhand couch I'd been meaning to get rid of. I planted herbs on the small back patio. I even adopted a lazy orange cat from the local shelter after one of my neighbors convinced me I needed something besides paperwork waiting for me at home. The cat ignored me most of the time, which somehow made us a perfect match. Family wasn't something I thought about every day anymore. Birthdays came and went. I mailed Christmas cards. Sometimes Ethan sent a short text. "Hope you're doing well," I'd reply. "You too." That was usually the entire conversation. No arguments, no reconciliation, just distance. And honestly, distance brought peace. One Tuesday morning, I drove out to inspect a ranch about 40 minutes outside town. The owner, Sam Turner, had inherited the property from his uncle and wanted help enrolling part of it in a conservation program. We spent nearly 2 hours walking the fields while he explained his plans. As we headed back toward the barn, he kicked at the dirt with one boot. "You know, what? I almost bought another place instead of this one." "Oh?" He nodded. "Bennett Ranch." My steps slowed just enough for him not to notice. "I heard they were thinking about selling a while back." "I hadn't heard that." "Maybe not selling." He scratched his chin. "I don't know all the details." We reached the fence line and he rested both arms on the top rail. "But from what people are saying," he looked over at me, "they're in a lot more trouble than anyone realizes." I felt my stomach tighten. Sam shook his head. "Honestly?" He looked back toward the pasture. "I've heard Bennett Ranch is dealing with some pretty serious problems." I tried not to react. "What kind of problems?" I asked, keeping my voice as casual as I could. Sam shrugged. "You know how rumors are." "I do. I've heard a dozen different versions." He leaned against the fence. "One guy says it's cash flow. Another says they expanded too fast. Somebody else swears they're fighting with lenders." "Lenders?" "That's what people are saying." He gave me an apologetic smile. "I wouldn't repeat any of it as fact." "Fair enough." He changed the subject almost immediately, asking about the timeline for his conservation application, and we finished the rest of our walkthrough without mentioning my family's ranch again. But the conversation stayed with me the entire drive back. Rumors didn't usually spread that far unless something real had started them. By the time I pulled into the office parking lot, I'd almost convinced myself to forget about it. Almost. I was halfway through answering emails when I noticed a familiar name in one of the industry newsletters that landed in my inbox every Tuesday. Agricultural Properties under Financial Review. Normally, I skimmed those updates. That afternoon, I opened it. Most of the list was exactly what you'd expect: small farms, a vineyard, a timber property. Then my eyes stopped. Bennett Ranch. I read the line once. Then again. The notice didn't say foreclosure, not yet, but it classified the property as being under elevated financial risk because of multiple secured loans tied to the land. I leaned back slowly in my chair. No. The office around me kept moving. Phones rang, printers hummed, someone laughed down the hallway. Meanwhile, I couldn't stop staring at the screen. Secured loans. Plural. That meant the ranch itself had been used as collateral, more than once. Megan walked into my office carrying a folder. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I quickly minimized the page. "Just reading something unexpected." "You okay?" "Yeah." She studied me for another second before setting the folder on my desk. "If you need help with the Johnson file, let me know." "I will." As soon as she left, I opened the report again. The newsletter didn't include much detail, just enough to confirm the financial classification. Nothing about why. Nothing about how bad things really were. I rubbed my forehead. When Ethan inherited the ranch, it had been almost debt-free. Grandma hated borrowing money unless there was absolutely no alternative. She used to say, "Land is patient. Banks aren't." I could still hear her saying it. So what happened? Had Ethan expanded too quickly? Bought expensive horses? built new facilities? Or had something gone wrong that nobody could have predicted? For the first time in years, I seriously considered calling him. My hand even reached for my phone. Then I stopped. What exactly would I say? "Hi, Ethan. I heard your ranch might be falling apart." No. That wasn't a conversation you started because of a rumor, especially after 3 years of barely speaking. Instead, I opened the county's online property records. Most land records were public. Mortgage filings, environmental easements, tax information, not every document, but enough to understand the basics. Some of the newer filings required formal requests before they could be reviewed. I clicked through the database until I found the property. The number of recent entries immediately caught my attention. There were far more than I expected. Loan recordings, amendments, revisions, additional filings. I stared at the list for a long moment. Then I picked up the phone and called the county records office. "This is Claire Bennett," I said when someone answered. "I'd like to request copies of the public filings associated with Bennett Ranch over the past 3 years." The county clerk told me the documents would be ready the following afternoon. I almost canceled the request twice. Part of me kept asking the same question. Why are you doing this? The ranch wasn't mine anymore. Legally, emotionally, practically. It hadn't been mine for years. Still, when the email came saying the records were ready, I drove over during my lunch break. The clerk handed me a thick envelope. "Everything that's public is in there," she said. "Thank you. If you need older archived filings, you'll have to submit another request." "I understand." I carried the envelope back to my office but didn't open it right away. Instead, I finished the client meeting I'd already scheduled. We talked about wetlands, permit deadlines, and fencing setbacks. For almost an hour, I managed not to think about Bennett Ranch. The moment my client left, I locked my office door. Then I spread the documents across my desk. Loan records, property filings, tax notices, construction permits. At first, nothing stood out. Then the timeline started coming together. About 6 months after Ethan inherited the ranch, there was a large commercial loan secured by part of the property. A year later, another one, this time for facility improvements. I found the building permits next. New horse barns, expanded training areas, additional boarding facilities. I leaned closer. They expanded. That wasn't automatically a bad decision. Plenty of successful ranches grew over time. The problem was the dates. Everything had happened within a relatively short period. Expansion before the first investment had time to pay for itself. Another loan before the previous one had settled. Too much, too fast. I kept reading. One report mentioned a breeding partnership. Another referenced imported bloodlines with unusually high purchase prices. There were no financial statements explaining the outcome, but I didn't really need them. The partnership disappeared from later records. No renewals, no follow-up permits, no expansion beyond the first phase. It had failed. Quietly. I closed my eyes for a second. Grandma would have hated this. She believed every major decision should survive one full winter before you made the next one. Her rule was simple. If the land can't support your idea, your excitement won't either. Ethan had never liked waiting. He was smart, hardworking too, but he'd always believed bigger automatically meant better. As I continued reading, another document caught my attention. A revised loan agreement, interest adjustment, collateral update. I felt my stomach tighten. More acreage had been pledged, not because they were buying more land, because the lender wanted additional security. I slowly leaned back in my chair. This wasn't one bad investment. It was a chain reaction. One loan leading to another. One setback requiring another promise. Another signature. Another risk. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. "Claire?" It was Megan. "You hiding in there?" I gathered the papers into a neat stack before unlocking the door. "Sorry." She peeked inside. I was going to grab coffee. You want one? I could definitely use one. Neither of us mentioned the documents covering my desk. We walked to the cafe downstairs, talked about work, laughed about one client's stubborn donkey that refused to let surveyors onto a pasture, and for 20 minutes, everything felt normal again. It was almost strange how ordinary life could continue while something enormous was unfolding somewhere else. Back upstairs, I finished reading the last few pages. The final notice wasn't dramatic, just factual. The property had entered a higher risk lending category because of its growing debt obligations. No foreclosure had been filed. Not yet. But I knew enough to understand what came next if nothing changed. I looked out the window toward the distant hills beyond town. For the first time since walking out of Daniel Morris's office 3 years earlier, I allowed myself to think something I hadn't wanted to admit. Bennett Ranch wasn't just struggling. There was a very real chance my grandmother's land could disappear forever. I closed the last folder and slid every document back into the envelope. That should have been the end of it. The ranch wasn't mine. The debt wasn't mine. None of the decisions that created this mess had been mine. I repeated those thoughts all the way home, almost like I was trying to convince someone, maybe myself. My orange cat greeted me at the front door with his usual impatient meow, reminding me that dinner mattered a lot more than family drama. I laughed despite everything. Yeah, I'm late. I fed him, changed into comfortable clothes, and tried to settle into my normal evening routine. A load of laundry, a simple dinner, half an episode of a show I'd been watching. None of it held my attention. Every few minutes, my mind wandered back to the same question. How bad is it really? I picked up my phone, set it back down, opened the county records again, closed them, walked into the kitchen for a glass of water I didn't actually want. I was restless, and I hated it. Finally, I said the words out loud. This isn't your problem anymore. The empty house didn't argue, neither did I. At least, not immediately. I sat on the couch and leaned my head back. Without meaning to, I remembered the last conversation I'd had with my mother in that conference room. Her voice had been calm, almost gentle. That somehow made it hurt more. You're too ordinary to carry something this valuable. Not angry, not emotional, just certain. For a long time, I'd wondered if she genuinely believed that, or if she'd simply needed a reason to justify giving everything to Ethan. Either way, she'd made her choice. So had my father. He hadn't agreed with her out loud. He hadn't disagreed either. Silence can sound a lot like agreement when no one speaks for you. Even Ethan. He looked uncomfortable that day. I still remembered him shifting in his chair and avoiding my eyes, but uncomfortable wasn't the same as refusing. He accepted the ranch. He accepted every acre, every building, every responsibility. And I accepted walking away. I stood and wandered through the house without any real destination, past the kitchen, past the hallway, until I found myself standing in front of the walnut chest again. I almost laughed. You have terrible timing, Grandma. The chest, of course, said nothing. 3 years. I'd managed not to open it for 3 years, partly because I wasn't ready, partly because opening it felt like reopening everything I'd worked so hard to leave behind. I rested one hand on the smooth wood. If there's a lesson in here... I stopped myself. No, I wasn't looking for permission to get involved. I wasn't looking for answers. I was just curious. That's what I told myself anyway. The brass latch looked exactly the way it had the night Daniel handed me the chest. Untouched. Waiting. I knelt down slowly. For a moment, I simply stared at it. Then I remembered something Grandma Vivian used to tell me whenever I avoided difficult conversations. Ignoring something doesn't make it disappear, sweetheart. I smiled despite myself. You really never stopped teaching, did you? My fingers closed around the latch. This time, I didn't pull away. With one quiet click, I opened the walnut chest for the very first time. The hinges creaked softly. That sound alone brought back memories I hadn't expected. Grandma Vivian hated throwing useful things away. If something could still serve a purpose, she kept it. Her old kitchen table, her leather boots, the faded notebook she carried for years. Even this walnut chest looked like something she'd rescued from another generation. Inside, everything was arranged with the same quiet care she brought to everything else. Nothing had been tossed in carelessly. Nothing looked accidental. The first thing I lifted out was a rolled-up map tied with a faded green ribbon. When I spread it across the coffee table, I immediately recognized the ranch. But it wasn't the version I'd grown up with. It was older. Handwritten notes filled the margins. Small circles marked water sources. Different colors outlined grazing sections. There were dates written beside several fields, along with observations in Grandma's neat handwriting. Rotate after heavy spring rain. Native grasses recovering well. Leave this area untouched another season. I smiled without realizing it. She hadn't just owned the land, she'd studied it. Beneath the map were several folders. Each one had simple labels: watershed, soil reports, county conservation records. I frowned. These weren't family keepsakes. They looked more like professional reference files. Curious, I opened one. Inside were copies of environmental assessments, correspondence with state agencies, survey notes, and handwritten comments squeezed into the margins. Some pages were decades old. Others were surprisingly recent. Grandma had kept updating them. My cat jumped onto the couch and immediately tried to sit on one of the maps. Seriously? He looked completely unbothered. I laughed, moved him onto a blanket beside me, and kept sorting through the chest. The deeper I looked, the stranger it became. There were journals spanning years, not personal diaries, working journals, weather patterns, water levels, plant species, government program notes, ideas she'd never shared with anyone, at least not with me. I picked up one notebook and flipped through a few pages. Every so often she'd written little reminders to herself. Ask Claire what she thinks about this. Claire would understand these regulations faster than I do. I stopped reading. My throat tightened. She'd written my name long before everything fell apart. Long before that meeting. Long before I convinced myself she'd chosen Ethan over me. I carefully closed the notebook and set it beside the others. At the very bottom of the chest sat a single envelope. Unlike everything else, it wasn't worn. It had been sealed carefully. Across the front, in Grandma's unmistakable handwriting, were just a few words. For Claire. Open only when you're ready. I stared at it for a long time. 3 years ago, I wouldn't have been ready. Maybe not even a year ago. Tonight? I wasn't sure, but I'd already come this far. I slid one finger beneath the edge of the seal. It gave way with almost no effort. Inside was a folded letter. Several pages. I unfolded the first sheet carefully, smoothing the creases with both hands. The first line was enough to make me stop breathing for a second. My dear Claire, if you're reading this, then you've waited exactly as long as your heart needed. I swallowed hard and began reading the rest of Grandma Vivian's letter. I took a slow breath and kept reading. My dear Claire, if you're reading this, then you've waited exactly as long as your heart needed. That sounded exactly like Grandma Vivian. She never believed grief had a schedule. She believed people arrived at difficult truths in their own time. The next paragraph made me stop for a moment. If the ranch is still thriving, then I hope this letter simply becomes a memory of an old woman who worried too much. If it isn't, I swallowed, then I imagine you've already begun asking questions. I leaned back against the couch. It felt less like reading a letter and more like having a conversation with her. Every sentence sounded like her voice, calm, patient, never rushing. She didn't begin by talking about the ranch. She talked about me. She thanked me for every weekend I'd spent helping her walk the fences instead of going into town with friends. She reminded me how fascinated I used to be by maps when I was little. You always wanted to know why one pasture stayed green while another struggled. I smiled through damp eyes. I'd forgotten that. Or maybe I'd simply buried the memory beneath everything that happened later. Then the letter shifted. "There is something I need you to understand." I straightened without realizing it. Families sometimes confuse love with agreement. When they stop agreeing with one another, they begin measuring worth in ways they never should. I read those lines twice, not because they were difficult, because they were painfully accurate. Grandma never criticized anyone by name. She didn't have to. I already knew who she meant. The next page answered the question that had quietly haunted me for 3 years. You may wonder why I didn't stop what happened. I stared at the words. Grandma continued. Please believe me when I tell you that I tried. She explained that the trust had been created while she was still alive, during a period when her health had started declining. The conversations had stretched over months. My parents insisted Ethan should control the ranch because he lived there full-time. They argued that keeping ownership divided would only create conflict later. Grandma had disagreed, more than once. But eventually, she realized something. Fighting harder wouldn't change their minds. It would only fracture the family before she was gone. I chose my final battles carefully. Some victories cost more than they are worth. A tear landed on the paper before I noticed I was crying. For years, I'd quietly wondered whether she'd abandoned me, whether she'd believed what my mother believed, whether she also thought I was too ordinary. Instead, she had seen everything. She simply hadn't fought the battle I expected her to fight. I wiped my eyes and continued reading. You may be angry with me for accepting their decision. I was. I whispered into the empty room. For a while, I really was. The letter almost seemed to answer me. If that is true, I understand. But trust me a little longer. Grandma explained that ownership and stewardship weren't always the same thing. Some people inherited property, others inherited the ability to protect it. At first, I didn't completely understand what she meant. Then I reached the bottom of the page. The final paragraph was underlined once. Not heavily, just enough to draw my attention. Claire, the greatest gift I could leave you was never the ranch itself. I slowly turned the page, wondering what Grandma believed could possibly be more valuable than 180 acres of the land she loved so much. I turned the page carefully. Grandma's handwriting never changed. Every line was steady, almost as if she'd written the letter knowing exactly when I'd need it. What I left for Ethan can be measured in acres. What I left for you cannot. I kept reading. For years, you asked questions no one else thought to ask. You wanted to know why certain fields flooded, why some grasses survived drought, why government inspectors always spent more time studying maps than fences. A small laugh escaped me. She remembered everything, even the questions I thought had annoyed her. You believed you were only helping me? You were actually learning. I looked over at the journals spread across my coffee table. The maps, the reports, the handwritten notes. None of them had been collected by accident. She'd been preparing them. For me. The next paragraph shifted from memories to something much more practical. There is a federal grassland conservation program that very few ranch owners ever understand before it's too late. Immediately, my attention sharpened. This wasn't just family history anymore. This was my profession. Grandma explained that large portions of Bennett Ranch qualified because of its native grasslands, watershed boundaries, and long history of sustainable grazing. She even listed the sections of the property that met the requirements. I quickly reached for one of the old maps. The markings matched. Every highlighted pasture lined up perfectly with what she described. I read faster. Enrollment in the program could significantly reduce long-term tax burdens. Certain conservation agreements could strengthen negotiations with lenders. If structured correctly, protected land often became eligible for financial restructuring programs that ordinary commercial properties couldn't access. I slowly lowered the letter. My heartbeat picked up. I know this program. I whispered it without thinking. Not only did I know it, I'd helped several ranch owners apply for it over the past few years. It was incredibly useful, but also incredibly complicated. Most people gave up halfway through because the application required years of land records, environmental studies, historical surveys, and legal coordination between multiple agencies. One mistake could delay everything for months. I looked back at the chest. Every document Grandma had collected suddenly made sense. She hadn't been keeping random paperwork. She'd been gathering every piece someone would eventually need. My eyes returned to the letter. By the time you read this, you'll understand this process better than I ever could. That is why these records belong with you. A lump formed in my throat. She had trusted my work long before anyone else respected it. Long before my career existed. Long before my own parents dismissed me. I kept reading. Perhaps none of this will ever be necessary. I pray that is true. But if the day comes when the land itself needs someone who understands it. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I already knew. The room had become completely silent. Even my cat had curled up asleep beside the couch. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, I stared at the final lines written at the bottom of the page. They were underlined once. Simple, direct, completely, Grandma. Protect the land. I paused before reading the rest aloud. Not the pride. I couldn't take my eyes off those 5 words. I read Grandma's last sentence 3 more times. Protect the land, not the pride. The words sounded simple. Living by them wasn't. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the journals instead of back inside the envelope. Then I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. I never drank it. I just stood there staring out the window. Rain had turned into a steady drizzle, soft enough that it blurred the lights across the street. My mind kept pulling me in 2 different directions. One side was painfully practical. You don't owe them anything. My parents had made their decision. Ethan had accepted it. 3 years had passed without anyone asking how I was doing. No phone calls, no apologies, no invitations home. If Bennett Ranch collapsed because of choices they made, wasn't that simply the consequence of those choices? I tried to hold on to that thought. It made sense, at least on paper. But every time I reached that conclusion, another memory pushed back. Grandma Vivian kneeling in the pasture, running dirt through her fingers, explaining why healthy soil smelled different after spring rain, stopping her truck just to point out wildflowers returning to an old grazing field. She never talked about the ranch as if it belonged to her. She always talked about it as if she was borrowing it from the next generation. The land will outlive us, she'd say. Our job is to hand it over in better shape than we found it. I closed my eyes. This wasn't really about my parents. Or Ethan. It wasn't even about being excluded from the trust anymore. It was about whether I could stand by and watch everything Grandma spent her life protecting disappear. I walked back into the living room and spread the conservation maps across the coffee table again. Now that I knew what I was looking at, the pattern was obvious. Grandma had already identified every section of the ranch that qualified. She'd organized decades of records. She'd practically built the application herself. She just hadn't lived long enough to finish it. I picked up one of the folders and started making notes. Eligible grassland, historical surveys, watershed reports, existing easements, property boundaries. The more I organized everything, the more one fact became impossible to ignore. The ranch still qualified. even after all these years, if action was taken soon enough. I leaned back and let out a slow breath. I could fix this. The words surprised me, not because I doubted my skills, because saying them made everything feel real. Fixing it wouldn't be easy. It would take months of documentation, legal coordination, financial negotiations, county approvals, state agencies, possibly federal review. And even then, there were no guarantees. Another thought followed immediately. Or, you could do nothing. No one expected my help. No one even knew Grandma had left me these documents. I could close the walnut chest, put everything back inside, go to work tomorrow, continue living exactly as I had the day before. Eventually, the bank would make whatever decision it made. Life would move on. Except, it wouldn't. Because if Bennett Ranch disappeared, Grandma's final lesson would disappear with it. I looked down at her letter again. For the first time since reading it, my decision felt less emotional and more practical. I wasn't choosing between helping my family and ignoring them. I was choosing between protecting the land or protecting my pride. I reached for my phone. There was only one person I trusted to tell me whether any of this was still possible. I found his number exactly where it had always been. For a second, my thumb hovered over the screen. Then I pressed the call button. Daniel Morris speaking. Daniel. There was a brief pause before he recognized my voice. Claire? Daniel sounded genuinely surprised. I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I know. There was a short pause. Is everything all right? I looked at Grandma's letter on the coffee table before answering. I think I need your help. He didn't ask any questions over the phone. Instead, he simply said, Can you come by tomorrow morning? I'll be there. His office looked exactly the way I remembered it. The same brick building, the same brass nameplate by the front door. Even the receptionist smiled the moment she recognized me. It's been a long time. It has? Mr. Morris is expecting you. She led me down the hallway, and when Daniel stepped out of his office, he smiled warmly. Claire, it's good to see you. You too. For a moment, neither of us mentioned the ranch. He asked about my work. I asked about his wife, who had retired the previous year. It wasn't awkward, just human. Eventually, he closed his office door and leaned back in his chair. So, I nodded. I finally opened Grandma's chest. His expression softened immediately. I wondered when that day would come. You knew what was inside? I knew some of it. He smiled. Vivian never showed me the letter. She didn't? No. She only told me it belonged to you. I placed the folded letter and several copies of the conservation maps on his desk. He adjusted his glasses and slowly looked through them. I haven't seen these in years. You recognize them. I helped Vivian organize some of the legal records. He turned another page. I didn't realize she'd kept everything. Oh, she kept everything. That made both of us laugh. It felt good. For the first time since learning about the ranch's financial trouble, I wasn't carrying the weight alone. Daniel carefully spread one of the older property maps across his desk. I remember this survey. He pointed toward a section near the southern pasture. Vivian insisted this area should never be developed. She wrote the same thing in her journal. I'm not surprised. He sat quietly for a moment. You know, he looked at me over the top of his glasses. She talked about you often. I looked up. Really? Especially after you started working in environmental compliance. What did she say? A smile appeared on his face. That you'd become exactly the person the ranch would someday need. I looked down at the maps before answering. I wish she'd told me that herself. I think... Daniel gently tapped the letter. She just did. For a few minutes, we reviewed the public filings I'd collected from the county. Daniel had already heard whispers about the ranch's financial situation, but he hadn't realized how quickly the debt had grown. The borrowing accelerated. It did. And if these dates are accurate, he frowned. They're running out of time. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then I showed him the sections of Grandma's letter describing the conservation program. Daniel read every line carefully. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair. I believe Vivian knew exactly what she was doing. You think this could still work? I think. He chose his words carefully. It deserves serious consideration. Hope returned for the first time in days. Not certainty. Just enough hope to keep talking. Daniel gathered the papers into a neat stack. Then his expression became more serious. There is something I need to ask before we go any further. Okay. He folded his hands on top of the desk. His voice stayed calm, professional. Claire. He held my gaze. Are you here because you want to challenge the family trust? Daniel leaned back in his chair and watched me for a few seconds. His question was still hanging between us. So, you're telling me you don't want to challenge the trust? I shook my head without hesitating. No. He frowned slightly, almost like he expected me to change my mind if he stayed quiet long enough. You understand that if there are problems with how it was created, we could at least review your legal options. I know. And you would have a reasonable argument. I know that too. He folded his hands together. Then why? I looked through the office window toward the old courthouse across the street. When my grandmother died, I lost more than the ranch. Daniel stayed silent. My family already decided who they believed in. Going to court won't change that. Even if I somehow win something, I won't get my grandmother back. I won't fix what my mother said. The room was quiet for a moment. So no, I continued. I'm not here because I want revenge. His expression softened. Then why are you here, Claire? I reached into my bag and carefully placed Vivian's letter on his desk. I'm here because the land doesn't deserve to disappear. Daniel looked at the letter but didn't touch it. You've read everything? I have. And you understand what she was talking about? I think so. I slid several of the conservation maps beside the letter. Not completely. That's why I came to you. He adjusted his glasses and slowly began reading the documents. Every few minutes he would stop, compare one page with another, then open one of the old property files from his cabinet. The longer he read, the less he spoke. Finally, he let out a quiet breath. I haven't seen these surveys in years. He reached toward another cabinet and unlocked it with a small brass key. Inside were several thick archive boxes. Vivian asked me never to destroy anything related to the ranch. He smiled faintly. I thought she was simply being sentimental. He carried 2 heavy boxes onto the conference table. Dust floated into the air as he opened the first one. Inside were property surveys dating back decades. Old tax assessments, environmental reports, letters between Vivian and state conservation agencies, even handwritten notes from meetings neither Ethan nor my parents had ever attended. Daniel carefully sorted everything into neat piles. I kept every file she ever gave me. You never told anyone? She specifically asked me not to. I looked around the room. So she really was planning this. I believe she was preparing for several possibilities, he answered. She never assumed life would go exactly the way she wanted. We spent the next hour comparing the old records with the public financial documents I'd collected. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. The ranch wasn't failing because the land had lost its value. The problem was debt. Too many loans, poor timing, expensive expansion projects, and almost no long-term planning. Daniel pointed to one of the maps. Vivian highlighted these grasslands years ago. I nodded. They qualify for permanent conservation. If the requirements are still met. They are, I replied before he could finish. I've reviewed enough similar properties to know. He looked at me carefully. You answered that awfully fast. Because I've helped dozens of ranch owners do exactly this. He leaned back again, this time studying me instead of the paperwork. You've spent the last 3 years quietly becoming one of the most qualified people in this state to solve this exact problem. I gave a small shrug. I guess life has a strange sense of timing. He smiled. I think Vivian knew exactly what she was doing. That sentence landed differently than anything else he'd said. For years, I'd wondered whether my grandmother had simply accepted losing control of the family decisions. Now I wasn't so sure. Maybe she hadn't surrendered at all. Maybe she'd chosen a different path. Daniel closed one of the folders. If we do this correctly, we might reduce their tax burden, strengthen their position with the lender, and create enough stability for debt restructuring. Might, he repeated. There are no guarantees. I don't need guarantees. He raised an eyebrow. I just need a chance. Daniel nodded slowly. I believe your grandmother would be proud of you. I looked down at Vivian's handwritten note one more time. Protect the land, not the pride. For the first time since walking into his office, those words didn't feel like advice anymore. They felt like instructions. Daniel pulled a blank legal pad toward us, uncapped his pen, and drew a line down the middle of the page. All right, he said. If we're going to save Bennett Ranch, he looked directly at me. Let's build a plan that nobody sees coming. Daniel and I settled into a routine that lasted for weeks. Most mornings started with coffee, stacks of property records, and long conversations that only people in our line of work would probably find interesting. So this parcel connects to the western pasture? Daniel asked one morning. It does, I said, sliding another survey across the table. But the conservation boundary can't stop here. If it does, the application won't qualify. He made another note. Good catch. That became our rhythm. Maps, tax records, environmental reports, loan documents, historical grazing records. Everything had to match perfectly. One missing document could delay the entire process for months, and Bennett Ranch didn't have months left. I still went to my regular job every day. My clients never knew that every evening I drove across town to Daniel's office and spent another 4 or 5 hours trying to save the very ranch my own family believed I had no place in. Sometimes I laughed at how strange life could be. By day, I was helping strangers protect their land. By night, I was secretly trying to rescue my family's future. Daniel eventually noticed I was exhausted. You need to sleep. I will. You've been saying that all week? I know. He smiled. Vivian used to give me exactly the same answer. That made both of us laugh for a second. Moments like that made the work feel a little lighter. As the paperwork grew, so did my confidence. The conservation program was stronger than I'd first thought. The ranch met almost every major requirement. Large portions of the grassland had remained untouched for decades. The streams crossing the property qualified for additional environmental protection. Even several older agreements Vivian had signed years earlier unexpectedly strengthened our application. It was almost as if she'd quietly been preparing the ranch for this possibility long before anyone realized it. Still, there was one rule we agreed on from the beginning. My name stayed out of everything. Daniel looked at one draft and circled the signature section. We'll submit this through my office. Good. The technical reports? Use my department's standard formatting. Nothing personal. The supporting recommendations? They should come from state guidelines, not from me. He looked at me. You've really thought this through. I don't want anyone rejecting the plan because of who submitted it. Daniel nodded. If Ethan sees your name, he'll stop reading. Neither of us said anything after that, because we both knew I was probably right. The plan had to stand on its own. No emotion, no family history, just facts. The proposal eventually grew into a thick binder. Inside was everything the bank, the county, and the Conservation Board would need. Debt restructuring recommendations, tax reduction analysis, long-term land management commitments, environmental compliance reports. Every page built toward one goal: Keep the ranch alive. One afternoon, Daniel closed the binder with a satisfied smile. I honestly didn't think we'd get here this quickly. We're not finished. No, he admitted, but we're close. I looked at the cover. Months ago, I would have given anything just to stop thinking about Bennett Ranch. Now I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not because I wanted ownership. Because I remembered every trail Vivian had walked with me, every lesson she'd taught me about taking care of something that would outlive us both. Daniel interrupted my thoughts. I've already spoken with the lender's legal department. I looked up. They're willing to review everything? They are. And the county? They'll cooperate if the property owner agrees. Property owner. Ethan. That one phrase reminded me of the biggest obstacle still standing in front of us. No matter how solid our plan was, no matter how much evidence we gathered, no matter how carefully we'd hidden my involvement, none of it mattered if Ethan refused to participate. Daniel leaned forward. He doesn't need to know who created this. He just needs to sign. Daniel nodded slowly. If he's desperate enough, he'll listen. I wasn't as certain. I hadn't spoken to my brother in nearly 3 years. I had no idea what kind of man he'd become, whether he was humbled or still convinced he already had all the answers. Daniel rested one hand on the binder. This is as ready as we can make it. I stared at the documents for another moment before quietly closing the cover. Everything we'd worked on for weeks, every late night, every careful decision, every page Vivian had quietly prepared years ago. It had all led to one final step. Now the future of Bennett Ranch rested in the hands of the one person who had nearly lost it in the first place. Daniel called me just before lunch. I think today's the day. I stopped typing and leaned back in my chair. They contacted him? They did. And? They've delivered the conservation package. I stared out the window of my office without saying anything. Weeks of work had finally left our hands. Now everything depended on someone who had no idea I was involved. I let out a slow breath. I guess we wait. That's all we can do. Waiting turned out to be harder than preparing the documents. I kept working with clients. I attended inspections. I answered emails. I sat through meetings. But every time my phone vibrated, my attention drifted. Not because I expected Ethan to call. He didn't even have my number anymore. I was waiting for Daniel. Around mid-afternoon, he finally called again. I've learned a little more. What happened? The bank gave Ethan a deadline. My stomach tightened. How bad? Worse than we thought. Daniel paused. They weren't discussing possibilities anymore. They were discussing timelines. For foreclosure? Yes. I closed my office door before speaking again. So he's out of options. Almost. Daniel had spoken with one of the attorneys representing the lender. They hadn't discussed confidential details, but they confirmed enough to paint a clear picture. The ranch had been leveraged several times. The horse breeding investment hadn't generated the income Ethan expected. Construction costs had gone well over budget. Interest rates climbed while revenues dropped. Each decision probably made sense by itself. Together, they became impossible to carry. He kept borrowing time, Daniel said quietly, and eventually time ran out. Exactly. For the first time since learning about the ranch's financial problems, I stopped thinking about Ethan as the brother who inherited everything. Instead, I pictured someone cornered by decisions he couldn't undo. That didn't erase what happened 3 years earlier, but it reminded me that failure rarely arrived all at once. It usually showed up one compromise at a time. Daniel called again near the end of the day. There's something else. What is it? Ethan didn't ask who prepared the proposal. I blinked. He didn't? No. Not even once? He was more interested in one question. What was it? Will this stop the bank? I looked down at the conservation map pinned beside my desk. That sounds like someone who's scared. I think he is. According to Daniel, the meeting had been brief. The lender's representatives explained that the conservation proposal could strengthen the ranch's financial position. County officials confirmed that several tax adjustments might become available if the application moved forward. The attorney summarized the process. There are obligations, he told Ethan. Long-term commitments, restrictions on future development, additional reporting requirements. Ethan reportedly asked only a few practical questions. Can we keep operating? Yes. Will this affect the horses? No. Does this give us a chance? It does. Daniel paused before continuing. He barely looked at the binder. I frowned. Seriously? He flipped through a few pages, signed where he was told, and moved on to the next document. He didn't read the technical reports? No. The financial analysis? No. The conservation recommendations? No. I almost laughed, but it came out as a sigh instead. Weeks of research, dozens of revisions, hundreds of pages. And Ethan didn't have the luxury of reading any of it. Not because he didn't care, because the pressure had become too great. Sometimes people reached a point where survival mattered more than understanding every detail. Daniel seemed to read my thoughts. When someone feels like they're drowning, Claire, they don't ask who built the lifeboat. Exactly. I rested my forehead against my hand. Part of me had expected resistance, questions, suspicion, maybe even anger. Instead, there had only been exhaustion, pure exhaustion. Daniel's voice softened. I don't think he signed because he trusted the process. No? I think he signed because it was the only option he had left. I quietly closed my laptop. Outside my office, people were heading home after another normal workday. Mine suddenly didn't feel normal anymore. Everything we'd spent weeks preparing, every page Vivian had quietly preserved, every careful choice to keep my name hidden. It had all crossed the finish line with nothing more dramatic than a tired signature. Daniel spoke one last time before ending the call. The documents are officially executed. I closed my eyes. For the first time in 3 years, Ethan had signed something that might actually save the ranch. I tried not to think about the application after Ethan signed it. There was nothing else I could do. The proposal had been submitted. The reviews had begun. Now it belonged to the county officials, the conservation board, the lender, and a long list of people I'd never meet. So I went back to work. At least, I pretended to. I was in the middle of reviewing a wetland assessment when my phone buzzed. Daniel. I answered before the second ring. Tell me something good. He chuckled. I think I can. I leaned back in my chair. The county accepted the initial filing. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. That's one step. It is. The lender? They're continuing the review. So we're still alive. We're still alive. It wasn't a victory. Not yet. But for the first time since this whole process began, things were moving in the right direction. Over the next couple of weeks, updates came one piece at a time. Nothing dramatic. Nothing happened overnight. That was actually a good sign. Real legal work rarely looked exciting. It moved through approvals, revisions, signatures, and meetings. One afternoon, Daniel called while I was driving home. I've got another update. I pulled into a parking lot before answering. I'm listening. The Conservation Board approved the land management plan. I smiled. Seriously? They asked for 2 minor revisions. I can handle that. You already did. What? The version you prepared anticipated both issues. I laughed. So all those late nights actually paid off? They certainly did. The revisions were submitted the same afternoon. 2 days later, they were accepted. Another door opened. Then another. The tax office confirmed that portions of the ranch would qualify for significant reductions once the conservation agreement became active. The lender adjusted its position. Instead of preparing for foreclosure, they agreed to continue negotiations. That single decision changed everything. Daniel called again. "This is the one you've been waiting for." I stood outside my office, barely breathing. "What happened?" "The foreclosure process has officially been suspended." For a second, I couldn't say anything. Cars passed on the street. Someone nearby was laughing. Life kept moving around me while I stood completely still. "They actually stopped it?" "Yes." "They're not taking the ranch?" "Not if the remaining conditions are completed." I closed my eyes. Vivian's ranch, her horses, her grasslands. They weren't safe yet. But they finally had a future again. Debt restructuring discussions moved much faster after that. The bank now had a reason to cooperate. Protecting the land also protected the value of the property. Instead of fighting each other, everyone suddenly had the same goal: keep the ranch operating, reduce unnecessary costs, create a long-term plan. It amazed me how quickly people became willing to work together once they believed success was possible. Daniel and I met one evening to review the final reports. He looked far more relaxed than he had in weeks. "I think we made it. We're close." "No," he corrected gently. "I think we actually made it." He slid a summary across the table. The ranch would remain in family ownership. The outstanding loans would be restructured over a longer repayment period. Tax obligations would be reduced under the conservation agreement. Commercial development restrictions were now officially attached to large portions of the property. Everything Vivian had hoped for was becoming real, not through a courtroom, not through revenge, through planning. I looked at the paperwork one more time before closing the folder. "I wish she could have seen this." Daniel smiled. "I have a feeling she expected it." A few days later, I heard something unexpected. One of Daniel's contacts had attended a meeting at the ranch. My parents were there. Ethan was there. Several financial advisors were there too. Everyone was talking about the same question. How did this happen? No one seemed to have an answer. Someone guessed a new state agriculture initiative. Another thought the lender had introduced a special hardship program. My father reportedly said, "Maybe we just got lucky." Even my mother accepted that explanation. According to Daniel, they genuinely believed some government conservation program had stepped in at exactly the right moment. Not one of them suspected that the entire plan had been built by the daughter they once called too ordinary. I quietly folded the update and slipped it back into my bag. For now, I was perfectly willing to let them keep believing that. Life became surprisingly normal again. That was the part I hadn't expected. For months, every free evening had been consumed by maps, financial reports, legal language, and conservation regulations. Then suddenly, it stopped. I woke up, went to work, met with landowners, reviewed permits, answered emails. It felt like my old routine had quietly returned, as if none of it had ever happened. Only Daniel and I knew that somewhere a ranch worth millions was still standing because of work nobody would ever connect to me, and honestly, I preferred it that way. One afternoon, I was walking a client through a grazing management plan when he smiled and said, "You know, you have a gift for seeing solutions before everyone else." I laughed. "I've just made enough mistakes to recognize the good options." He shook his head. "No, that's experience." I thanked him, but Vivian's voice echoed in my mind instead. "Protect the land, not the pride." For the first time, those words didn't sting. They felt peaceful. A few weeks passed. Daniel occasionally sent short updates. Everything continued moving forward. Loan payments had been reorganized. The county completed the conservation registration. Tax adjustments were beginning to take effect. The ranch was stabilizing exactly the way we'd hoped. Then one Friday afternoon, Daniel called while I was cleaning my desk. "I heard something interesting." "What happened?" "I met with one of the financial consultants." And? They still think the government stepped in. I smiled. Seriously? They've built an entire story around it. I couldn't help laughing. What kind of story? They believe someone at the state level noticed the ranch qualified for emergency conservation assistance. And nobody questioned it? No. What about Ethan? He apparently tells people they were fortunate enough to qualify for a rare program. I leaned against my desk. My parents? Same belief. My mother? Daniel actually laughed. Especially your mother. That surprised me. She never wondered who prepared all those reports. No. Not once? No. Apparently, everyone accepted the simplest explanation: government assistance, good timing, a lucky break. No one imagined that someone inside the family would quietly spend months solving a problem without asking for recognition. Daniel lowered his voice. You know what's strange? What? Nobody has tried to find the person responsible. I thought about that for a moment. Maybe that shouldn't have surprised me. People often stopped asking questions once a crisis ended. The danger disappeared. Life moved on. The mystery wasn't important anymore. I wasn't sure whether that hurt or relieved me. Maybe a little of both. Weeks turned into another month. I found myself thinking about Bennett Ranch less and less. Instead of wondering how things were going, I trusted the system we'd built. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying my family's decisions on my shoulders. I had done what I believed was right. That was enough. Then my phone rang. Daniel. His voice sounded different this time. Not worried, not excited, just thoughtful. Claire. Everything okay? Mostly. Mostly? There may be one small complication. I sat back down. What kind of complication? I've been reviewing the final administrative filings. I waited. The conservation agreement itself is complete. Good. The restructuring documents are complete. Also good. But whenever a lawyer says, but, you know something is coming. He sighed. One final document still has to be filed with the county archives. Okay. It's a procedural requirement. I frowned. What does it require? A public certification. So? It has to identify the lead conservation consultant responsible for preparing the technical plan. The room suddenly felt very quiet. I already knew where this was going. Daniel didn't need to finish the sentence. There was no way around professional licensing rules. Technical work couldn't remain anonymous forever. Someone had to stand behind it. Someone had to certify it. And that someone was me. Daniel finally said the words neither of us wanted to say. When that document is filed, my name becomes part of the public record. Yes. I slowly looked out the office window. For months, staying invisible had been easy. Now one routine administrative requirement threatened to undo all of it. Claire slid the final document across the conference table and read it one more time before touching the pen. Everything looked exactly the way Daniel and I had planned it. The conservation agreement had already been approved. The restructuring package was active. The emergency liens had been frozen. Bennett Ranch wasn't going to disappear under a foreclosure notice anymore. There was only one page left. One signature. One line that couldn't legally stay blank. Prepared by Environmental Conservation Consultant, and right beneath it, Claire Bennett. I stared at my own name for so long that Daniel finally broke the silence. You don't have to do this today. I looked up. You've already done the hard part. I know. If you walk away now, I can ask someone else to file the final paperwork. It would delay everything, but we'd find another way. I almost laughed. There isn't another way. He didn't argue, because we both knew it was true. The state required the lead consultant who designed the conservation package to certify the final submission. That person had been me from the beginning. For weeks, we'd managed to keep my name off every draft. This one couldn't hide it. I leaned back in my chair. 3 years. 3 years of building a life that had nothing to do with my family. 3 years of pretending Bennett Ranch belonged to another chapter of my life. Now one signature could pull me right back into it. Daniel folded his hands. "What are you afraid of?" I answered without thinking. "I'm not afraid they'll hate me." He waited. "I'm afraid they'll think I did this because I wanted something. Money, the ranch, recognition, an apology. Any of it." Daniel shook his head. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think you spent 3 years proving the opposite." The room fell quiet again. I remembered my grandmother's letter sitting safely in the wooden chest back home. Protect the land, not the pride. She hadn't written, protect your reputation, protect your feelings, protect yourself from awkward family dinners. Just the land. That had always been the assignment. Not revenge, not vindication. I smiled a little. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "My mother always said I was ordinary." Daniel smiled back. "I've met a lot of extraordinary people." He paused. "They usually spend their lives trying to convince everyone they're important." Then he nodded toward me. "You've spent yours trying not to be noticed." That hit harder than I expected. Because it was true. At work, I never talked about my family. When clients thanked me for saving their ranches, I accepted the handshake and moved on. I didn't need newspaper articles. I didn't need plaques on walls. Doing the work had always been enough. Maybe Grandma had seen that before anyone else did. I picked up the pen again. For a second, I imagined simply walking away. The ranch would probably survive anyway. Someone else would eventually figure something out. Maybe. Or maybe not. I wasn't willing to gamble with the place where my grandmother had taught me how to read weather from the grass, how to respect fences that weren't mine, how every acre carried someone's history. This wasn't about Ethan anymore. It wasn't even about my parents. It was about keeping her legacy alive. Daniel quietly turned the document toward me. No pressure. I smiled. "Liar." He laughed. "Fair." I lowered the pen. My signature came naturally, almost without hesitation. Claire Bennett. That was it. No dramatic music, no speech, just ink drying on expensive paper. Daniel collected the document carefully. "I'll submit it this afternoon." I nodded. "When they read it, they'll know." I took a slow breath. "I guess it's time." Daniel stood and offered his hand. "For what it's worth?" I shook it. "Your grandmother would be proud." I didn't trust myself to answer. As I walked toward the parking lot, my phone stayed silent. No calls, no messages. The sky above Silver Pines was perfectly clear, and for a few peaceful minutes it almost felt like nothing had changed. Then Daniel's phone buzzed behind me. He looked at the screen, frowned slightly, and called out before I reached my truck. "Claire." I turned around. "The bank just scheduled a mandatory family meeting." He looked from the message back to me. "They've already received the signed documents." I almost forgot about the meeting. Life had a way of filling every empty space once I let it. My workload kept growing. New conservation projects landed on my desk almost every week, and Bennett Ranch slowly slipped back into the background. I knew the restructuring was moving forward because Daniel occasionally sent short updates, but I never asked for details beyond that. I didn't want to. I'd already done what Grandma had asked of me. Then, almost 4 months later, Daniel called. "They've scheduled a formal review meeting. Is something wrong?" "No." His answer came quickly. "Actually, that's the surprising part. Everything is going much better than expected." I relaxed a little. "So why the meeting?" "I'll explain when you get here." "You sound mysterious." He chuckled. "I've learned from your grandmother." That made me smile despite myself. A few days later, I parked outside the same law office where everything had started. Nothing about the building had changed. The same brick walls, the same polished glass doors, the same reception desk. Yet walking inside felt completely different this time. 3 years ago, I'd walked in hoping my family would finally see me. Today, I didn't need that anymore. Daniel met me near the hallway. "Good morning." "Morning. You doing okay?" "I think so." He studied my face for a second. "Nervous?" "A little. That's normal." He handed me a visitor badge. "Your family's already here." Of course they were. I took a slow breath before following him toward the conference room. Voices drifted through the partially open door. Mom was talking before I even stepped inside. "I still don't understand why the bank insisted on attorneys being involved." Dad shrugged. "They probably have more paperwork." Ethan looked exhausted. Not the frantic, desperate version I'd imagined months ago. Just tired. Like someone who hadn't slept well in a long time. He glanced up when I entered. For a split second, we made eye contact. He gave a small nod. I returned it. Nothing more. No hugs. No awkward conversation. Just two people who hadn't really been siblings for years. Mom noticed me next. "Oh." That single word carried plenty of surprise. "I didn't know you'd be invited." I didn't either. Which was mostly true. Daniel had simply asked me to attend. He hadn't explained why. Mom looked confused but quickly turned back toward Dad. "I guess they invited every beneficiary." I didn't correct her. Instead, I took the empty chair nearest the end of the table. Not across from anyone. Not beside anyone. Just somewhere neutral. The room slowly filled with accountants, bank representatives, and two state officials I'd actually worked with before. One of them recognized me immediately. "Claire." He smiled. "Good to see you again." "You too. We're still using the habitat restoration model you developed." "I'm glad it's helping." We chatted for less than a minute. When he walked away, I noticed my mother watching us. Her eyebrows pulled together. "You know him?" "A little." "From work?" She looked genuinely surprised. Before she could ask another question, Daniel entered carrying a thick folder. Everyone quieted almost immediately. He placed the folder on the table but didn't open it. Instead, he looked around the room, making eye contact with each of us. "Thank you all for coming." His voice was calm, measured, exactly the way I remembered. "I know many of you are wondering why you've been asked to attend today's meeting." Several people nodded. "The purpose of today's meeting is simple." He rested one hand on the folder. "We're here to officially close the emergency restructuring process for Bennett Ranch." I caught Ethan letting out a slow breath. One of the bank officers smiled. "The ranch has successfully met every requirement ahead of schedule." Dad looked stunned. "Ahead of schedule?" "Yes." The officer nodded. "The foreclosure process has been permanently withdrawn." Mom grabbed Ethan's arm. "I told you everything would work out." Ethan forced a tired smile. "I guess." People around the table exchanged relieved looks. For the first time in years, my family looked like they could finally breathe again. Daniel waited until the room settled. Then he opened the folder. "There is one final matter that must be entered into the official record." The atmosphere shifted. He removed a single document and placed it carefully in front of him. The bank, the conservation board, and the state all agreed that today's record would be incomplete without formally recognizing the individual responsible for designing and coordinating the recovery plan. Silence spread across the room. Mom frowned. "I thought this was a government program." "So did I," Dad added. Daniel slowly shook his head. "No." He looked around the table one last time. "The government approved the program." The room fell completely silent. Daniel rested one hand on the folder in front of him before speaking. "Before I identify that person, I think everyone deserves to know what actually happened." The bank representative nodded. "I agree." Daniel opened the file. When Bennett Ranch entered financial distress, foreclosure had already become the bank's most likely outcome. Years of loans, the failed horse breeding investment, and the stable renovation pushed the debt beyond what normal refinancing could solve. Ethan lowered his head without saying a word. Daniel wasn't accusing him, he was simply explaining the facts. The bank executive leaned forward. Our internal review concluded that the ranch would almost certainly become bank property. Mom stared at him. What? I know that's difficult to hear, he replied, but that's where the numbers were leading. Dad frowned. I thought we were negotiating. You were, the executive answered, but negotiations alone couldn't fix the financial structure. Daniel pulled out several maps. Everything changed when an independent conservation proposal was submitted. One of the state officials continued. The proposal protected part of the ranch's grassland, making the property eligible for conservation funding and a debt restructuring program. Dad looked confused. I don't understand any of that. You don't need to, Daniel said calmly. What matters is that someone had to design the entire plan. He looked around the table. Someone prepared every environmental report. Someone handled the legal filings. Someone coordinated with state agencies and the bank until every requirement was satisfied. The state official smiled. And very few people have the experience to do all of that. My heartbeat became impossible to ignore. Daniel continued. The documentation filled hundreds of pages. The bank executive nodded. Without those documents, our board had already approved foreclosure. Mom slowly turned toward Ethan. You never told us it was that serious. He rubbed his face. I knew we were in trouble. I just didn't realize how close we were to losing everything. Daniel closed one folder. There's something else you should know. The consultant responsible for this recovery never requested ownership, never challenged the family trust, and never asked to be recognized. Mom frowned. Why would anyone do that? No one answered. Finally, the state official said quietly, because some people care more about protecting the land than receiving credit. Daniel nodded. Exactly. He placed one final document on the table. Every draft remained anonymous. The family's names appeared. The bank's names appeared. The state's names appeared. But the consultant's name was intentionally left off. Dad slowly shook his head. I still don't understand. You don't have to understand the reason, Daniel replied. Only the result. He turned toward the bank executive. If this conservation package had never existed, where would Bennett Ranch be today? The answer came immediately. It would belong to the bank. Silence filled the room. Mom looked stunned. Dad couldn't take his eyes off the documents. Ethan sat perfectly still, as if those words had finally made the last 3 years real. 3 years ago, everyone believed I wasn't capable of protecting the ranch. Now they were hearing that it had survived only because someone had quietly protected it from behind the scenes. Daniel picked up the last page. The final filing required one legal disclosure. He glanced at the signature, then slowly raised his eyes. For the first time, the consultant's identity became part of the official record. My hands tightened beneath the table. The bank officials looked at me first. Then the state representatives. Ethan followed. Dad turned next. Mom was the last. Within seconds, every pair of eyes in the room was fixed on me. My mother was the first to break the silence. No. She stared at Daniel, then at me. No, that can't be right. Daniel slid the signed document across the table. It is. She picked it up with trembling hands. My father leaned closer, reading every line twice. Neither of them spoke. Ethan didn't even reach for it. He was already looking at me, not with anger, not even with disbelief. Just exhaustion. Daniel quietly closed the remaining folders. The records are complete. The conservation plan, restructuring package, and legal filings were all prepared under Ms. Claire Bennett's supervision. The bank executive nodded. Without her work, Bennett Ranch would now belong to the bank. No one argued. There wasn't anything left to argue about. Mom slowly looked at me. You did all this? I did. Why? It wasn't an accusation. It sounded like a question she'd never imagined she'd have to ask. I answered honestly. Because Grandma asked me to protect the land. I left out everything else. The letter, the wooden chest, her final words. Those belong to me. Dad rubbed both hands over his face. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything? I do. His voice cracked. We were wrong. Hearing those words should have felt satisfying. Instead, they just felt heavy. 3 years ago, I would have waited forever to hear my father admit that. Now, I wasn't sure what to do with it. Across the table, Ethan finally spoke. I owe you an apology. I looked at him. I should have listened to you years ago. He gave a small, embarrassed laugh. I kept telling myself I could figure everything out. He shook his head. I couldn't. No one interrupted him. I thought owning the ranch meant I knew how to run it. He looked down at his hands. It turns out those aren't the same thing. The honesty in his voice caught everyone off guard. I was too proud to ask for help. He met my eyes. And you still saved it. I nodded once. I wanted to save the ranch. Not win. Not prove anyone wrong. Just save it. Mom wiped at the corner of one eye before looking toward Daniel. There has to be something we can do. Daniel stayed quiet. She turned back to me. We want to fix this. Dad nodded immediately. The trust. He looked at Daniel. Can it be amended? It can. Dad didn't hesitate. I want Claire to own half of Bennett Ranch. Mom quickly added, not just that. She looked directly at me. We'll give you equal management authority. We'll transfer part of the family investment account. You should have a seat in every decision involving the ranch. Daniel listened without interrupting. Dad continued. We made a terrible mistake. We'd like to correct it. The room grew quiet again. Even the bank representatives seemed curious about what I would say. Ethan slowly pushed his chair back a few inches. If she says yes? He looked at me. I'll sign whatever needs to be signed. Then he smiled, tired but genuine. I've already learned I was never supposed to carry this place by myself. For the first time in years, there wasn't competition between us, just honesty. Mom folded her hands together. Claire. Her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. Please let us make this right. Every person in the room waited. Daniel didn't speak. The bank officials remained silent. Even Ethan lowered his eyes. I looked around the table. The same people who had once decided I was too ordinary to be trusted with the ranch were now offering me half of it, along with control, investments, and a place at every family decision. I took a slow breath. Then I finally began to answer. I looked around the room before answering. My parents sat across from me, looking older than I remembered. Ethan hadn't stopped rubbing his hands together since Daniel finished explaining everything. Nobody spoke. Finally, my father cleared his throat. We want to fix this, Claire. My mother nodded. We'll amend the trust. Half of the ranch should be yours. You'll have management rights. We'll create a family investment fund. Whatever you want. I didn't answer right away. A few years ago, those words would have meant everything to me. I had spent so much of my life hoping someone in my family would finally see me. Now, I realized I wasn't waiting for that anymore. Ethan leaned forward. I owe you an apology. His voice cracked in a way I'd never heard before. I thought I could handle it alone. I honestly believed Grandpa chose me because I was the strongest. He gave a quiet, embarrassed laugh. I wasn't. I didn't even understand half the things you eventually fixed. The room stayed silent. I'm sorry, he said again. Not just for the ranch. For treating you like you didn't matter. I believed he meant it. That didn't erase everything. It just meant he had finally stopped pretending. I folded my hands together. I don't want the trust. Everyone looked confused. I don't want half the ranch. My mother blinked. Claire, I don't want ownership that comes from guilt. Daniel stayed quiet, letting me finish. The conservation program is already protecting the land. That's enough for me. My father frowned. Then what do you want? I thought about Vivian, about the wooden chest, about every page she had left behind. Then another face came to mind. Lily, my niece. She was still young enough to become someone different from the rest of us. If this family really wants to make things right, I said softly, create an education fund for Lily. Everyone stared at me. I want her to have every opportunity we never gave each other. Let her study whatever she wants. Let her travel. Let her grow up believing people are valuable because of who they are, not because they're the heir to something. Ethan lowered his head. We can do that. No, I corrected gently. You have to want to do that. He looked up and nodded once. I do. For the first time in years, nobody argued, nobody negotiated, nobody tried to convince me I was asking for too little. Daniel smiled faintly. I think Vivian would have liked that answer. A few months later, I drove out to the protected grasslands. The wind still carried the same dry scent I remembered from childhood. The horses moved across the open fields without fences cutting through the horizon. Native grasses swayed in long waves beneath the afternoon sun. Everything looked peaceful, not perfect, just alive. I sat on an old wooden fence and unfolded Vivian's letter one last time. The paper had softened from being opened so many times. My eyes settled on the final sentence. Protect the land, not the pride. I smiled before carefully folding the letter again. For years, I thought my family had taken my inheritance. Now I understood they never could. Land can be owned, money can disappear, trusts can be rewritten. But wisdom has to be chosen. I slipped the letter back into my bag and watched the horses run across the grasslands. Some people inherit property. A few inherit the courage to protect what truly matters. It turned out that was the only inheritance I had ever needed. If this story stayed with you, maybe it's because we've all wanted recognition from someone who couldn't give it. Sometimes the greatest freedom comes when we stop measuring our worth through another person's approval and start living by our own values instead. If you've ever experienced something similar, I'd love to hear your thoughts or your own story in the comments. And if you enjoy family drama stories with emotional journeys like this one, don't forget to subscribe so we can share the next one together. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next story.